let's start off with, what is your definition of racism?
Oh, geez, let's start with a really easy question. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And so I should say that I've been doing this work for a long time, and so this is kind of one of my issues. But and so racism is a term that kind of gets used a lot. But generally we define racism as defining a group of people who are identified as a race or with racial characteristics as being somehow inferior. I mean, which is different than prejudice. You can say, I don't like people from Washington, the state of Washington, but that's not racism. You're not thinking that they're less than. You're just you have a negative attitude towards them. But racism is based on the idea that, that we're sort of dehumanizing a group of people, that they're somehow less than. And it's, without going into all kinds of detail, we actually have sort of a starting point of the idea of racism, which is the slave trade, and that the Catholic Church had to come up with a way of justifying the enslavement of other human beings. Because if you know the story of Moses, let my people go. It would be very hypocritical for people who believed in the story of Moses and the slaves of Israel to enslave other people, but they needed cheap labor for the new world. And so the Pope signed off on this declaration that says the people of Africa are not people, they're animals. They don't have a soul, which is kind of strange to think about when you think about soul music. I'm like, this is pre-Aretha Franklin, so they really didn't have soul music to go on. And, a whole nation of people were defined as less than human. And that's that's the starting point of racism. And then we've extended that to Native Americans and sort of everybody else that we can apply that to. So that's the idea, is that you're sort of defining someone as inferior, a group of people as inferior.
And
that's a very complex thing, and I just sort of spewed out there and blamed it all on the Pope. But that was the root, is that slavery needed a way to make Christians to not be hypocritical. And if you're enslaving non-humans, then you're fine, you're not the Pharaoh. So that's the root of it. At least that's one theory. It comes from this historian named Howard Zinn, who did a history of when people started talking about other people. Because before that, Africans were just people from Africa. They weren't seen as on any type of ranking. They were just people who were from Africa, like people from Pittsburgh. Then all that changed with the colonial trade of slaves. Okay, I'll try to be a bit briefer on the other questions, or we'll be here all day. I'll never get back to my salad.
Where do you think racism is occurring today?
Well, it happens everywhere. It happens, where we see it in Portland most clearly is in policing. The Portland Police Bureau did a study and found that they do engage in racial profiling. And not only are they more likely to pull over minority folks more often, but it's whites that are more likely to have contraband in their car or have outstanding warrants. So if we should be profiling anybody, it should be people that looks like me. But so that's one of the places we see it. We see it in the banking industry, and who gets home loans and who doesn't. And the housing crisis of 2008 was largely fueled by predatory lending and banks actually going after people without a lot of wealth, mainly in the black community, and saying that you can own a home, we'll give you this loan, and then selling the loan. It's very complicated, but the kind of collapse of 2008 had a lot to do with racism in the banking industry. So it's sort of all over the place. And then, we see it within minority communities. In the county of Los Angeles, the most common hate crime is black on Latino, followed by Latino on black. So, racism is sort of all around, and we like to think we've made a lot of progress, and we have made so much progress. It's amazing just look at who's sitting in the White House, but a lot of these issues still haunt us, including the denial of racism. That's another way people say we don't have racism anymore. That is racist, because it denies the real lived experience of people of color.
So leading
so much
from
for being brief, right?
Leading from that, what are your views on subtle racism, and how do you think it should be handled?
Yeah, and the way subtle racism is the hardest to deal with. So I come from the South. I grew up in a Klan town in Georgia, and if somebody's flying the rebel flag, you kind of know what they're all about, right? They're wearing their racism on their sleeve or on their truck or something. What we call symbolic racism, where people sort of deny racism, is more problematic. So, what was the question again?
What are your views on subtle racism, and how do you...
Well, yeah, it's more insidious, and subtle racism has a lot to do with privilege, and I think privilege is the dirty word in our society. Men don't want to talk about male privilege, straight people don't want to talk about straight privilege, and a lot of white people don't want to talk about which is, I know if I turn on the TV, most of the people are going to look like me. Like, that's just an example. Or I know that police in Portland are less likely to pull me over, even though I may have like a dead body in the trunk. I don't, but yeah. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a lot more challenging to deal with, and it's rooted in this notion of privilege. That would be my answer.
Okay.
Which is a very dirty word in our society.
How do you feel about affirmative action against racism?
Well, affirmative action really isn't against racism, but it tries to undo the institutional racism of the past. It's been an old white boys club for a long time, so we created affirmative action to try to bust through those doors that have been closed to people. It's interesting that affirmative action is primarily, the largest group that it's helped has been white women, because women are helped by affirmative action as well, and veterans, by the way, white veterans especially. Affirmative action goes after a bunch of sort of institutional blockages to try to break through that old white boys club. And we still need it. We need it, and we also benefit. So I have two answers to it, briefly. One is we still need it, and two is we're better off for it, because the more diverse our environment is, whether it's in the workplace or the university, the better off everybody is, including the white males who are there, who used to be sort of as only white males. We know that students get a better education the more diversity there is in their classroom. I don't have to explain the experience of racial profiling to my students, because there's probably somebody in the class that's like, well, let me tell you what happened to me. And so they don't just have to take it from the white guy who's sitting in the classroom. So we're all stronger because of affirmative action.
What progressions, if any, do you think society will make in the future in terms of eliminating racism?
Ooh, well, man.
Or will it ever be eliminated?
We are the world, and we shall overcome, and all those great songs. Well, the news is good. The news is generally good. When we look at surveys of especially of young people, you find that people are more likely to have friends from different backgrounds. People are more likely to have gay friends, and so if we look at those surveys, the world. It used to be people say, well, I couldn't be a racist because where we grew up there was only white people. But there's fewer and fewer of those places like that anymore. You can be in Montana and you can find yourself in kind of a diverse Portland. Portland is known as a very, very white city because of the history of Oregon as being a white-only state. We were founded as a white-only state, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like more and more diverse. So the more we mix it up because of either affirmative action or just people moving around, the more those preconceived notions that people have. My grandmother knew nothing about Muslims. She never met a Muslim. And I'm like, okay, Grandma, let's go talk to some Muslims. And once she talked to some, a lot of her preconceived notions and her bigotry kind of went away, because she's like, well, they're not like that. So the more we mix it up, the more it just sort of seems silly. And I admit this on camera, but I'm kind of a Star Trek person. And in the Star Trek world, 200 years from now, they look back at this sort of racism and sexism as like, what was that all about? So we're getting there. In Europe, it's way past that. Europe looks at America and says, why are you still hung up on race so much? So we have lots of pictures from places around the world where they're way ahead of where we are. But we're heading in that direction. It goes up and down. Sometimes things like after 9/11, there was a big backlash against Arabs and Muslims who had nothing to do with the attacks. So there was a big spike in Islamophobia and stuff like that. So it's not a straight line. This is what I learned in my research, is you think that you're so much farther, and then all of a sudden, the Klan is marching down your street, and you're like, well, I guess we aren't as far as we thought. But generally, things look good. And plus also more and more people define themselves as biracial or multiracial. Every time we do the census, there's just a bigger chunk of the people that are like 4 or more races. And so race is a silly concept anyway. There's nobody just like white or black. We're all just sort of flesh color, various shades. Right?
Based off of that, do you think that racism is learned, or do you think that we're inherently racist?
No, we're not inherently racist. Race is a social construct. It doesn't exist. We make up these categories, and ultimately we're all mixed. What are the people of Afghanistan? What race are they? They're like everything. So we construct these categories. You're in this box, and you're in this box, and we invent those, and then they become very real to us. But they don't exist. They're made up by human beings, so we have to learn to accept them, and we can learn to unaccept them as well. A little bit briefer.
So switching onto your research topics, how do you go about picking a topic to research?
Well, a question pops into your head that seems to be important to the world, and that hasn't been fully addressed. We never sort of prove anything or answer any questions, but we're trying to find evidence for what we think is going on. So, for me, late 1980s, when I started as a grad student, there was this sort of new thing that was happening, which were the Nazi skinheads. The racist skinheads in Portland had a big problem. Where I'm from in Atlanta, we had a big problem with them. And my question was, why are people doing this? Why are young, sort of middle-class white males mostly joining this new racist group? I mean, it seemed like we should leave all this stuff in the past. And so it seemed important to me. And the research I'm doing now is on prisons and prison visitation, and we incarcerate more of our population than any country on earth. 1 in 100 Americans is behind bars, and what happens to those people when they come out, it seems like kind of an important question. So you find something that sort of motivates you and you feel passionate about. The last thing anybody wants to do is research something they don't really care about, because it's like going to be the most boring. There are people who do that, but for me it's something that you think is important.
So what are your research methods after you come up with something that you...
Well, that's a really good question, because you have a question and you have to find the methodology that fits it. And we want to be scientific. We're not sort of trying to prove anything or be political. So we want to find a good scientific method. So you have to find one that's the most appropriate. I mean, when I was doing the skinhead thing, it didn't make sense to go to a Klan rally and hand out a survey. On the scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about these things? So qualitative research made more sense. So I went undercover for years in the white supremacist movement, because it seemed like the best way to sort of understand how that world works. And now I use what are called guided conversations. They're sort of long interviews with inmates. So I go out to Eastern Oregon and sit in a prison and talk to folks and write down all the things that they say. So it's sort of finding the methodology that makes the most sense. But some people can do it, the research, analyzing data that other people have collected. They can just sit in their office and do it on the computer. I like getting dirty, like getting into the field.
So what's the biggest challenge in performing a study?
Well, in sociology, one of the big issues is that our subjects are human beings. We're not studying chemicals or rats in a maze. We're studying people. So there has to be a strict ethical guidelines, because we kind of learned about the worst possible from the Nazis in Germany, and the incredibly horrible tests that they would do. I mean, they would put like a baby out in the snow just to see how long it would live. Like, we can't. That's the opposite of ethical research. So we want to make sure that nobody is negatively harmed by our research. So that's a kind of a really important hurdle. And for me, inmates, there's sort of 3 populations that are the most protected: children, pregnant women, and inmates, because inmates could easily be abused for research. So we have a strict process by which we go through, and sometimes it's difficult because I want to get my research done, and I want to ask questions that are sometimes difficult, and somebody might say, I don't know, this is a population that we want to protect. So the human subjects thing, which is important, but also creates obstacles. I have a grad student right now who's over the reason I'm not with him is because I'm with you, but he's over at the Human Subjects Review Board because he's interested in studying white supremacists in the military, and they want to make sure that the research doesn't end up hurting anybody. If somebody finds out that they were in his study, somebody might want to kill them, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. So he's over there right now talking to them about trying to get his research approved. So that's the biggest thing. In sociology, that's, I think, the biggest thing is the human subject. And it's also nice if you can get money to fund your research. That part also helps. But for me, it's just sort of getting the approval because we want to make sure that we don't hurt anybody in the research.
So if you could go back and change anything about any of your previous studies, would you?
Oh, God. Oh, my gosh. It seems so, I started doing this in the late 1980s, and it seemed so primitive. I mean, I did a lot of, we didn't have the kind of cool technology that we have now, like recording stuff on your phone. I had a Walkman. I had to put all these cassette tapes in. And, there was a lot of ethical issues in my research, including some of the people I was studying may have been showing off for me and may being more racist and more violent just because I was there. So what would I change? I would do it quicker. I spent a lot of time. I mean, one of the things when you're doing field research is this notion of going native, where you spend so much time in the field, you start to lose your objectivity, and then you're just sort of with these people, you're not actually studying them, and that happened to me a lot. I spent a lot of time, I ended up singing in a skinhead band, and so a lot of time I could have been actually writing my dissertation. I was drinking beer and singing these punk rock songs with these skinheads. So for me, the main thing is I would be more disciplined. I mean, now that I assign people to do this type of research, I'm like, here's the deadline, this part needs to be turned in by this date, and that was where I want people to learn from my mistakes. And the other thing about this type of research is you have to write, when people say things, you have to at least go somewhere and write it all down very quickly, and I would wait, I'm like, oh, that was really good, I'll write it down this weekend, and then by the weekend I'm like, oh, what did that person say, or like, I'll write it down next week. So the idea of being much more disciplined is something that I teach my students, because I wasn't. My project took a long time because I wasn't disciplined.
So besides being disciplined, do you have any advice for students in sociology and performing these types of studies?
Well, sure, I have all kinds of advice, but I mean, the big thing is about protecting your subjects. So like things like confidentiality, making sure that people's names aren't connected. I had an article come out about skinhead recruiting. And I changed all the names in it so nobody knew anything about it, but I forgot one place, like the school where this was happening was Milwaukee High School, and I changed the name Milwaukee High School, but I missed one of the Milwaukees, and it was published, and I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, I got this publication, and it says Milwaukee High School. Oh my God, somebody could say, oh, I know exactly who he's talking about, and I'm going to get these guys. So, the issue of confidentiality is something that we talk a lot about in my research classes. And also my big piece of advice is getting a project that's doable, because people want to explain why everything happens in the world, and that's great. If you got the next 10 years free, you can work on it, but the best project is a done project, so let's narrow that research question down. Let's get a good methodology that goes with it so you can get done in a timely fashion. Because I spent 8 years in grad school working on this project, and that's a long time. I basically burned up my 20s doing this work, so yeah, to be more disciplined and to kind of pick a project that you can actually accomplish in a timely manner.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you for that.
yeah, cool, yeah.